Get ready before life happens. The podcast helping you navigate life's what ifs.
Welcome to Get Ready Before Life Happens. I'm your host, Tony Stewart. Today, I'm joined by Joy Levin, certified professional retirement coach. Joy, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, Tony, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to do this.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. So let's jump in. Tell us a little bit about yourself. What is your origin story, and how did it lead you to helping people create their Encore identity?
Well, I would start off by saying, I have been a solopreneur for almost 30 years, owned my own business, and loved it. But then several years ago, I started thinking, I've always been curious about what other people do in their lives and their professions. And so I started thinking about that and realizing, what else would I do? And at the same time, I had clients saying to me, I'm thinking of retiring, but I have no idea what I would do. And then I started thinking, oh my gosh, if I retired, I would be lost. And so I started to think about that and sort of decided, why don't I check some things out and figure out what maybe I would do, or I don't know. I don't know what I was looking for exactly. But through that journey, I stumbled upon retirement coaching. And I thought that is such an interesting idea to work with people on the non-financial side of retirement to figure out how to continue to have purpose and meaning and relevance. And so that's kind of how I started doing this. So, I feel like I am living my own encore by having both of these careers that I really enjoy.
That is awesome. And it makes me think of, I'm actually in my second phase. A friend of mine, he termed it turning the page when you move on to a new career. So I'm definitely in that encore phase. But I think what you say is so important is that you have to have purpose, meaning, and relevance. Is study after study shows that when people don't have those things in retirement, is that their health quickly declines. So it's
Definitely.
such an important thing. And from what you said, it doesn't have, money maybe enables us to do certain things in retirement, but that's not really the core here.
Exactly. And it's so true what you said because I have had so many people tell me, I remember when my father retired and he just kind of sat in a chair and watched TV. And I think, I mean, it's true. The research bears it out and their empirical evidence bears it out that people decline much faster. They have shorter lives that are less satisfying. So it's just become so important to realize this is just another chapter and another opportunity and how to make the most of that.
Yeah, I love it. Retirement is another opportunity because I think people don't look at it that way. They look at retirement as like a finish line, when really
Exactly.
some of us, I mean, I don't know how long I'm going to live, but some of us are going to live 30 to 40 years, after our
Exactly.
retirement age. So that's a long time, and which is a
It
great,
is.
like you said, an opportunity to do something.
It is. And the thought of spending, 10,000 or 15,000 more days on a golf course, like it just doesn't work for people. And that's one of the big changes is that because we're living so much longer, we have so much still left in the tank. And so to just think of, having a life that doesn't really have a purpose or relevance is really unfortunate. So yeah, I think a lot has changed.
Yeah, sorry. My mind was going like, how many hours of television would that be? It would be a lot.
I know. A lot. Yeah.
So, as we talk about it, why is the concept of retirement outdated then?
Yeah, I think there are a number of reasons. First of all, and I'm thinking of Gen X. I'm a Gen Xer, and that's the cohort that's beginning to move into retirement. And so a lot has changed. For one thing, we can no longer, rely on pensions. And so the structure of how corporations worked has changed. Now it's up to the person to fund their 401(k). The company is not going to give you a pension in most cases. So that's one way things have changed. Also, we had kind of structures built in that people retire at the age of 65, and that's changed, because of longevity. So there's a lot that's happened that kind of just changes the whole equation. The other piece of it, I think, is, when I think about Gen X, we've become such a independent and resilient generation, very adaptable to changes in technology. And when I think about all that we've gone through from the energy crisis of the 70s to the Challenger disaster to the dot-com, all that stuff, all those coming of age kind of events have made us so resilient and independent. And so people are more interested now in kind of making sure they still have their own agency in retirement. And so when you think about the old sort of narratives around retirement, oh, I'm just gonna, sit on a boat or whatever it is, it just doesn't fit anymore. People have a lot more that they want to do in life. And so it's not surprising to me when people come to me and say things like, I just have no idea what to do because, you know, that old narrative of retirement is just not going to fit for what I want to do, but I have no idea how to get there. So I think that's a lot of reasons why it's changed so much.
Yeah, and as you're talking is, that, I'm reflecting that I don't really know anybody who retired exactly at age 65, and people who talk about golfing, they burn out on that pretty quickly. All
They
these
do,
things.
yes, they do. Yeah, I call it I find that there's one of two paths that a lot of people take, not everybody, but a lot of people, and I call it either the honeymoon or the hard landing. So some people do this honeymoon kind of phase where maybe 6 months or a year or whatever it is, every day's a Saturday, and that's exciting for them and they enjoy it. And then after a while, though, they're realizing, okay, but what's my purpose? Like, why am I still here? What am I going to do with my life that has meaning? And for the other people that have that, what I call a hard landing, they figure that out right away. Like all of a sudden, the calendar is empty. And, what about all the competencies I still have and the skills? How can I what do I do? Just put them somewhere and never touch them again? So that's what I kind of see happening is yes, people kind of sometimes think, oh, this is great, just leisure. But for a lot of people, it just doesn't work.
Yeah, the word hard landing, I think, is an excellent word for it because it's not only a hard landing in terms of purpose and having things to do, but it's a hard landing because you have to switch from an accumulation
Yeah.
phase where you're maybe accumulating new skills as you're talking about, but you're also accumulating money. And all of a sudden, you can spend things and you can do things on your own, uh, that you want to do. So it's a huge mental shift for people that I don't think we're prepared for.
Yeah. And I know a lot of advisors, financial advisors, find that that's a difficult challenge. Like, we've been counseled all these years. You're going to be responsible for your finances in retirement. You better save, you better save. And so people are in this mindset, like you said, of accumulating and saving. And then all of a sudden, okay, now you can spend. What? Like it's a total mind shift. And, people, it's hard for people to get their heads around that. Yeah.
Yeah, so I love that. So you talk about an encore identity. What is an encore identity?
Yeah. So where the way I envision it is sort of what I've built into my retirement coaching practice, where what we do is build an encore map. So, it starts with your values. And I think for some people, that's a difficult starting point because a lot of people sideline some of their values during their careers. And so they have to figure that out again. But it's all about, what gives you energy? What do you like in other people? All of these are clues to your values. And so, what I believe is everything you do should tie into your values, especially in retirement, because during our careers, we sometimes had to push those off to the side. So, now is a time when you can really live those. But because a lot of people have forgotten them or aren't really clear on them, that's the first thing we do. And that lays the foundation for the rest of this map, which consists of, your passions and your purpose and your people, like who do you want to be with? What roles do they play for you? How do you want to connect with people? And your place, like do you want to downsize? Do you want to right size? Do you want to change your state or your country or whatever it is? And so all of that, when you build all of that with that values foundation and these four pillars, you end up with what I call the Encore identity, which looks at how are you going to wrap this all in together to live this life of meaning and relevance. So that's kind of how I envision it.
I love that. And I think that that resonates with people is, getting to live with your values. That's a lot of people work in philanthropy, they
Hmm.
volunteer
Hmm.
their time, and that's a great thing to do in retirement. So could you go through the four pillars a little bit more
Sure.
in depth?
Yeah. Yeah, sure. So, like I said, there's the values foundation. That's really different. And then there's the passion. What is it that gives you that energy? What excites you? And some people can't even get their heads around that. Like, oh my gosh, I just finished working full time. Like, I have no idea. Other people have some idea, but aren't sure how to get from point A to point B. So that's one pillar is what is going to make you feel like I am getting up today with a purpose and with something that I'm going to do that gives me, that energy that lights me up. So that's the passion, and then the purpose is what is it that my life is going to have meaning for? Like, why am I here, and how can I channel these two things together to make something that's relevant not just to myself, but maybe to other people, so I can kind of have this feeling where it's important to people that I show up every day or when they want me. And then there's the people aspect, which I find one of the more challenging aspects. And it's really about your social life. When we step back from a full-time career, a lot of people realize their social network kind of falls apart. The people you worked with have either moved on, you don't see them every day or in the roles you're used to. People that, maybe you had friends because you're a parent and they're a parent of a friend of your kids, they're moving away or they're doing other things. So that social component is really a tough one for a lot of people. So that's the people aspect. And so it's figuring out who are the people that you want to be around? Who were you around before? And where are the gaps? And where have you lost some connections? And how can you reinvigorate those? Um, and so that's three of the P's. And then the last one is place. So what's your environment like? So it's not just where do you live necessarily, it's what kind of community do you want to be involved with? What do you want to do within this community? And where is that community? And, what does it look like? So all of this is explored in exercises and tools that I use with clients to figure all of this out so that they can leave feeling like, okay, now I have an idea for what my next chapter is going to look like. The other thing I'll add to that is, and I know you didn't ask me about this, but it's something that goes hand in hand for me, is, a lot of people say there are three phases to retirement. There's the go-go, the slow go, and the no-go. And I find that it's not really accurate, and it actually assumes that everybody follows a very predetermined pathway. And so what I really see again with this Encore framework is an Encore arc where you have this honeymoon or hard landing, and then you go through this period of recalibration, figuring out all of these pieces, and then you move into this phase that I call the flourish, where, life is not necessarily perfect, but you're doing something that has that meaning and relevance for you. And I think that people move through this arc many times during their final chapter or their next chapter. They kind of find maybe they've figured out a flourish, and then 5 years later that has changed. It doesn't give them the same energy. And so they revisit this arc. And so that's kind of how I see it unfolding.
Yeah, well, and we're talking about a very long period of time for a lot of
Mhm.
people nowadays.
Mhm.
When we think about some of these things retirement wise, is a generation ago, people weren't living well beyond 65. We talk about the onset of Social Security, and people were living on
Exactly.
average 3 to 4 years. And
Now it's 10
so it's
times
very,
that.
Yeah, so it's a different thing. So where do you find that people struggle with thinking about their encore identity?
Yeah, I think there's a number of places. For one, I think it's very disorienting to have been told all your life, oh, there's retirement as the goal, as the end point. And then when they get there and all of these things fall away and they're struggling, it's very destabilizing for them. And so I think that's one of the bigger things they struggle with. And I think another piece is, frankly, the social aspect. A lot of people have not developed relationships intentionally during their careers. The people they work with, their kids' friends' parents, their spouse's friend's spouse, or whatever it is. It hasn't always been very intentional. And so, what they find, in my experience, is all of a sudden, when all of that falls away, they have no idea how to intentionally build a new social ecosystem. And it takes some reflection. And so a lot of the exercises I do focus on a lot of this stuff, about this new social ecosystem and how to build that, how to re-energize it. And so those are some of the things I find that people really struggle with is this feeling of total bewilderment. Like I thought retirement was the goal and it was going to be rainbows and whatever. And when it's not, it's really quite, like I said, destabilizing and disorienting. Yeah.
Definitely. Well, and I think it's important that when you're talking about your retirement planning, that this is part of it, is
Mhm.
coming up with a real, this is a plan. Because it's
Yes,
not, money is just what fuels us to be able to do
exactly.
certain things.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's awesome. And that's something, I know with us is, once my son grew up, is, we're not hanging out with the parents of his friends anymore.
Hmm.
Everybody sort of drifted away doing their own
Right.
thing. But that was our
Right.
social circle for quite a long time.
Exactly, exactly. And, it's having to rebuild that. And I think it's also very intimidating. People think, oh my gosh, I have to build a whole new social life, but it really isn't. And that's one of the things I work with people on is instead of thinking of it as like something you have to sustain all the time and put all this energy in constantly, if you just think of it in small little bursts of experiments, and that's another big piece of what I do is where you end up, and I'll talk about that in a second, but it doesn't have to be a big thing. It's little steps you take once in a while over time. That's what can get you this greater energy because once you have a couple of those successes, it it kind of reinvigorates you and gets you to have more of them. Yeah.
I love that. And that's like anything is, is you have to break it down instead of trying to, eat the elephant all at
Hmm.
once is,
Exactly.
is to sort of slow down.
Hmm.
So how does the Encore map then help people move forward with clarity and confidence?
Yeah, it really touches upon, all of these different pieces coming together in a way that helps them realize this is who I am now. I was this person before, and it's not, I don't mean to say that all of a sudden, you're a completely different person. But it does help you figure out there are things that worked for me in my career that are not really going to work for me in this next chapter. And so it's really guiding people to figure out what are the things that I want to take with me? What are the things I want to leave behind? And so I've also created this kind of creative framework, a way of looking at it, which I call from mixtapes to meaning, because as a Gen Xer, we all made those mixtapes. And so I kind of use that as a theme to look at kind of five aspects. The first is the rewind phase, where you're identifying that core fuel, looking back over time, not just your career, but maybe earlier in your life, and figuring out what are the things that give me energy, what excites me, what are the things that I look forward to. And then there's what I call the next step is remix, where it's figuring out, okay, now how can I find new forms to express those, energy or that fuel? And then the next stage is reset. And that's when you figure out, okay, this no longer fits the way I want my life to be. And it could be the way you pursued relationships. It could be some of the way you spent your time. it could be a lot of different things. And so it's figuring out what can I leave behind that no longer suits me and no longer works for me. And then the fourth piece is the reconnect, rebuilding that supportive network, so that you can avoid some of that isolation that is so terribly disabling. And then the final step is what I call revive. And that's where you do these kind of micro experiments to figure out, okay, let me try this. And I think that's what relieves some of the intimidation is we're not talking about major life overhaul. We're talking about little experiments you can do over time that shed insight for you into what your life can look like in this next chapter.
Why I love it. And, this is something that I think is so important is that we're spending all this time saving for retirement, but that's not really what I think people are as interested in is they're as interested in, you're like, okay, like you said, what am I going to do? Most people are thinking about like, okay, what am I going to do in retirement? Yeah, there's a few people who do say, well, I'm going to travel, I'm going to golf.
Right.
But like we've talked about, is that wears thin pretty quickly, unfortunately.
It does. And that's so a lot of people feel very disillusioned when they reach that point because they feel like, wait a minute, this is what I was told my whole life, and I was going to love it. And it was going to, I didn't care about all that other stuff. And then they realize, wait, I still do care about it, especially if you've been a high achiever, if you've been, an executive or a business owner and you've exited your business, you've sold it, and then you're like, okay, now what? And I hear from also from some adult children who worry about their parents seeing them, struggle with that. It's just the narrative. Those old narratives don't necessarily fit anymore. Yeah.
Yeah, so you need to have a transition plan.
Mhm.
So to wrap up, Joy, I have what's called the Get Ready Hot Take Trio. These are three quick questions I ask all of my guests.
All
The
right.
first one is, what's one retirement myth you're trying to break?
Oh, wow. That's a great one. One retirement myth I'm trying to break is the idea that retirement is going to look the same for everybody. That, these prescribed kinds of imagery that we've grown up with and that we've sort of inherited and, kind of thought that's it. It's going to look different for everybody. And I would say there's another piece to that, which is once you realize that it doesn't fit, that is normal. Like we have to normalize this. This is understandable and it's normal and it's to be expected because of how things have changed. So I would say, you asked me for one myth, I would say it's kind of one and a half.
Oh, that's great. That's a great myth. And I think that's so important. Is like, we were talking about is sometimes people stop working early, sometimes they work
Hmm.
longer,
Hmm.
sometimes they partially phase out, or like me, well, like both of us have a second career that we take on, it's just something new and exciting. Um, so let's get out the time machine for a minute. If you could go back in time, knowing what you know now about retirement, what advice would you give your younger self?
Um, I think I would tell my younger self to experiment more often. Like I said, I was in really one career for my entire full-time working career life. I mean, one thing I did that I'm glad I did is start my own business early. But I think one thing I would tell myself is do these micro experiments because you might find things that you don't even have to wait until you retire to do. You might find that you really enjoy whatever it is. Like even the social piece. I think if I could tell myself, make an experiment, reach out to somebody you haven't talked to in a long time, or whatever it is, that's probably the one piece of advice I'd give myself.
I love that. Do the little micro experiments along the way because I think some people do that is they do wait for retirement and then all of a sudden it's like you've been saying, it's a hard stop. And all of a sudden it's like,
Mhm.
whoa, and you
Yeah, and
have
you
to
don't
do all
have
these
that
things.
momentum. Yeah, you have to, that's why I tell people, ideally you should do this kind of planning like 3 years or so, 2 or 3 years before you think you're going to retire, so that you can set things in motion and you're not just waiting, and then you're hit with it. Yeah.
Yeah. So to wrap up, what is your number one tip to help people change the way they think about their second act?
Um, I would say to realize that I would say just making small changes are going to make a big difference. And also to realize that when you begin struggling with this, it makes sense to talk to other people about it because most people think that I've talked to, nobody else feels this way, right? Everybody thinks, oh, this is the end. But when you think about it, there wasn't necessarily a guidebook for life, but we followed a very set kind of pathway. Okay, in your early 20s, you get your first job, and then maybe you move up, and then you switch industries or whatever it is. But it's realizing, that doesn't have to be, first of all, that's not true anymore for when you reach midlife. That progression is no longer spelled out for you. And that's because of how retirement has changed. So that's one thing I would tell people is just realize that if you feel this way, it is 100% normal. And I think talking about it with other people will be a great relief when you realize I'm not the only one that feels this way.
Yeah, I love that. And I think especially right now, we're going through a time of disruption. And,
Mhm.
with technology and everything, that it's going to radically change. It
Mm.
already is radically changing everything.
Yes.
That, that you have to be a little flexible, but that you're not alone on these journeys.
Yes. And the good news is, like I said, for Gen X, we are highly adaptable. We, more than any other generation, saw massive technological change in our working lives. And so we've had to adapt. So, in a sense, you've done a lot of the hard work before. Now it's just kind of channeling it in a different way.
Definitely, definitely. So, Joy, where can people learn more about you and your work?
Yep. My website is genxencorelife.com. And I'm sure you'll have that in the show notes. And also, you can email me, jlevin at genxencorelife.com. I have a what I call an Encore starter guide on my website that you can download for free. And it gets you thinking about some of this stuff. And it sort of allows you to explore some of these questions in a way where maybe you don't want to talk to other people about it first. You want to kind of think about it. So that's there for you too.
Awesome, awesome. And for everybody watching and listening, as always, if you have access to the show notes, you will find those links in the show notes. Joy, thanks for joining us on the Get Ready Before Life Happens podcast.
Oh, Tony, thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, appreciate it. And thank you, everyone, as always, for tuning in to this episode of Get Ready Before Life Happens. If you learned something today to change the way you think about your second act, please be sure to share and subscribe. Um, you can also go to tonystewart.com to join the Get Ready movement and get access to my free library of resources. Until next time, let's change the way we think about money.